Hi, I'm Brainerd Carey, and today I want to talk about museums and what it means to get your art into a museum. So, as an artist, whether you're primarily a visual artist, painter, or work in digital media, from video to photography to film to performance, as an artist, working in a museum is usually a great boost to your career. Right, everybody would like to be in a museum at some point. So today in this talk, it's part of the series of what it means to be a successful artist, and I want to address what it means to get into a museum and how you can do it and how it can help your career. So to begin with, it helps your career, of course, because a museum is a prestigious institution. And by prestigious, what really is meant there is that there's some kind of sense that if you have a show in a museum, that it's a type of validation on your work, that it's a type of embrace of your work, which not only feels good, it lets other galleries and institutions know that you're making work that's good. So it's a step up in your career. It's helpful to be exhibited in a museum because it gives you not just more visibility, but it's also giving you a platform to now meet other museums and meet other galleries. Okay, so how do we get into a museum? So let's take the example of a painter, but this works the same whether you're a sound artist or a photographer, or you make primarily drawings or prints or any other medium. So there's a few ways to get into a museum, but first I should say that there's two halves to a museum, right? There's a curatorial half of the museum, a curatorial department, if you will, and then there's an educational department in a museum. Now, museums' purpose, of course, is to serve the public, and this is the case globally, right? They're an educational institution, essentially. So the curatorial half of the museum is just about exhibiting artwork, right? They have different curators that are in charge of putting together shows. Some of those shows, many of the shows, often come right from the museum collection. It's not new art at all. And occasionally they have one or two shows a year, sometimes more, where they're showing contemporary artists that are even local to the museum. That's the curatorial wing. It's in charge of exhibitions. Then there's the educational wing. The educational wing is in charge of everything from public talks to Zoom talks to anything that's educational, including the guides that take people through museums, that give tours, anything that has to do with outreach to the public and education. And oftentimes in the education department, you'll see artists doing programs or workshops. That means when you go to the museum's website, which you can do now on your local museum, whether you're in New York or Istanbul or anywhere around the world, look at the museum website near you and you'll see programming coming up, events. That's the educational department. There are events. So take a look at what kind of events they offer. And sometimes you'll see they're artist-driven events. And by artist-driven events, I mean it'll be something like a talk from an artist about graffiti locally and its history, something like that. You often see artist talks, or you'll see maybe a panel on something like that, graffiti's relationship to the Renaissance, or and I'm being kind of off the cuff here, coming up with what you might see, but they're going to be different kinds of programs, workshops, lectures, and the workshop could be with children, with adults, and giving the example of, let's say it was a graffiti based exhibition where you're teaching children and adults some of the tools of graffiti, and they're learning some of what it means, some of the language of being a graffiti artist. Those are workshops, right, that help them understand an exhibition. So I'll talk more about how to get involved in that, but that's a very important distinction. They're not giving shows, they're doing workshops. So as an artist, you have two choices, and you can do both of them. There are museums that have open calls, and I have a list of them on Praxis Center, website for members, but you can simply search on the internet, open museums that have open calls, or just, art museum open call. And you'll see many museums sometimes have an application process where they do have a show, a group show of new artists, and you can apply. And it should be for free. Any museum that's any good shouldn't charge you for applying for an open call. So you can type in open call art museums. And if you're a member of Praxis, we have a list of those. But there are museums that are accepting proposals, and you can always send them one. So you can research that and do that. And the proposal just means this is my artwork. And you explain a little bit about what you do and how a show would work. In all the curators that I've talked with that come to Praxis Center, which is the online school that I direct, all the curators tend to say what they like to hear is, what is your art about? What are you about? What are you trying to say? So as you present to a museum, which just means you're sending them a letter and a PDF, explain what the work is about, what you're trying to do with this, why you're making what you're making, and what a show would kind of be the message. What would be the message of a show that you put together? So if you're a graffiti artist, let's say I'm using that example today, and you're having a show, what that show would be about is perhaps your work, but also putting it in the context of the history of graffiti, because it's important to you, let's say, that as a graffiti artist and a person living in a certain area, that the message is about something specific. And so you can talk about that. That would be interesting to a curator, right? Same goes for painting, video, other mediums. So you can give proposals to museums that way. I also often talk about the process of meeting curators directly and making proposals to them, which you can also do as a member of Praxis Center if you're a member. If not, by the way, there's a link below to learn more about this school. But as a member of Praxis Center, we have curators that come in every week that explain how to reach them. And sometimes they say, cold calls that explain. And by a cold call, I mean an email that you just send to them. Can get them interested, and often they want to hear more, that it's a long game. It's not just this is good, let's take it. It's often they want to keep in touch with you. So so you can always write to a curator directly. As a Praxis member, you get all their email addresses in Praxis Center, of course, but you can also just look up a curator and write to them at their institution. That would work. There's always an info mail at every institution, and you can just ask the letter to be forwarded to them. So that's about proposals. The last thing I want to say is the educational department in a museum. That's a paid gig if you get it. If you get into a show that's in the curatorial part of the museum, you don't get paid for that usually. Maybe there's an honorarium, but usually you don't get paid. If you do an educational gig, you get paid. So what that means is look at your local museum, look at what kind of public programs they're doing. That's the educational department. And look at what shows are coming up. So if you see, they often do Zoom talks by artists who are discussing art, because that's kind of a cool thing to have. Instead of a historian or an educator from the museum, you have an artist talk about the art. That's something we see more in museums. So because it's coming from an artist's point of view. So look over what they do and then propose something to the educational department. And that's pretty straightforward. There's a director in that educational department. You can call the museum to find out more about that. But that's where I would start. And if you do that, frame it like one of their programs. So if they do programs where, artists are talking to, other artists, or artists are talking to, a group of people about how something works, model it on one of their programs. Take one of their programs and just adjust the words so it fits what you're doing. That's what they want to hear. But also what they want to hear is that it helps the visitors understand the current exhibit somehow. So, and this of course is separate from curatorial, this is educational. So look at what the museum is doing, your local museum is doing in 6 months, or 5 months, or 4 months. What is that exhibit that's coming up? Is it a contemporary exhibit or a historical exhibit? Is it something from their collection? Let's say it's something from their collection. It's an exhibit of photographs of the 19th century or something. So then propose a workshop that has to do with your work, whether you're, again, graffiti painter, photographer, performer, or you work with digital or any kind of photographic media. You can propose a workshop that is about your work, the way you see the world, but have it somehow support what's happening at the museum right now. So if the show is 19th century photography, for example, you can say, I'm going to talk about video, and we're going to do a video workshop, or I'm going to talk about the history of video or painting or photography and how it influences one another. As a painter, you could talk about how 19th century photography, for example, influenced painting, and how you've used photographs or thought about them in some of your work, how they help structure even abstract work. Or you could be talking about, video or photography, but if you can make a bridge between your work and a way of understanding the current show, that appeals to museums. That's very interesting to them. So, so I hope this is helpful. Today, what we talked about was how to get into a museum, and either there's the curatorial department and the educational department. Curatorial department, you can make a proposal to. You can there are museums that accept proposals, and you can do it by PDF. You can either do the research on your own, or as I said, Praxis Center also has those kind of lists. The other thing is the educational department in museums. You can get a paid gig by it's a separate department, by working with a museum's educational department, doing a workshop for kids, adults, seniors, however you want to structure it. You'll see what they do. That's usually a paid gig. It could be a lecture, a Zoom talk, all kinds of things. Propose it based on what's coming in the future in the museum, so that it will be helpful to their visitors. That's a good way to get a paid gig and then be part of the museum. And that's the summary. So I hope this was helpful. For all members of Praxis, of course, you know a lot about this, and I'm happy to look at your proposals. If you have any questions, anybody, you can always ask in the comments below. And I want to thank you for being an artist and for watching this today.